Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today I'm going to paint one of the Eldar Farseers, one of the greatest psychers in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and an all-round really cool miniature. But I've always found them pretty daunting, and the same is true of most of the Eldar range. But I'm going to show you today, it's pretty simple. All you got to do is break it down step by step. We're just putting paint on a miniature, and there's no need to overcomplicate it. Now this could go a little bit further. If you had the time and inclination, I think you could really push these miniatures. They do benefit from a lot of extra work. But for those of us who don't have a huge amount of time, here's how I paint things. So, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. So once your miniatures all cleaned up and assembled, it's time to prime them. And I want to talk a little bit about why I've chosen the Army Painter's matte white primer here. The reason mostly is in the question of surface texture. The CITADEL contrast primers, by comparison, have a very smooth finish, which allows the contrast to sort of run off of the high points, collect in the recesses, and do all of its contrast magic. Whereas if you were to use something like Corax White, it is a very nice, it's just off white, got a little bit of blue in there, but it has a, not rough, but there is a texture to it. It holds paint very well, and when you varnished it, you get a nice smooth finish, and life is good. But for using contrast, it can be a little bit bitty, and you'll find that that can make it slightly challenging to get a smooth finish over. By comparison, the Army Painter primers, they tend to have a very almost glossy finish, and depending on what you're painting over the top of them, that's not always ideal, but for our for our Farseer here, that little bit of glossiness to the primer is really going to help us with what we're doing. So that is why Army Painter White rather than Corax White. So our first area of color might come as a bit of a surprise here. What I've got is a small layer brush and some black Templar. And I'm going to paint in his face. Reason being, if I make any mistakes here, and I've got real shaky hands today, gosh, I will be able to paint over the white again before we carry on with any other details. So painting towards the edges so that the contrast will pool there. Now in order to get a solid black, I have applied 2 coats of contrast both to his face and on his boots, which you'll see drying there. Now I've got a little black splash there, and ordinarily I would say that you leave your cleanup stages till last. But because we're going to be effectively layering some of this contrast, what we need to do is to dip back to our white a little more regularly. So what I'm going to do is start here by tidying up the edge of his helmet and just lightly dipping into the eye to brighten that up. So now I'm going to tidy up any white areas, which I do not want to be black, because you'll find inevitably there will be a few little splashes here and there. Now, I actually had to come back a couple of times and tidy up that face more than once. I was really about to lose my patience with it. Can happen to anybody. But just crack on, try and take a deep breath and remember that sometimes you just gotta go through it. And once it's painted, it will always be painted. So that little bit of investment of time, you'll be all right in the long run. I have now some Ethermatic blue, and I'm gonna go ahead and dot in the eyes. Not too worried, once again, if I do hit the white on the top of his helmet. And as well as his eyes, the other thing I'm going to do is to get a little more of this on my brush. And I'm going to paint in the blade with this as well. At last, we can move on to painting his clothing. Now, we're going to follow the usual method of painting upward. So starting from some of the lowest areas, and then painting over the top of them as we go, because we'll find it easier to tidy up if we need to. I'm going to start here. I have Skeleton Horde, and this is a nice, just off yellow beige kind of color. What I'm going to do is get up under his clothing here and start applying this to the inside of his cloak. Now, if you need to apply a little more of this, try and keep your brush moving in the same direction, because it will help the contrast do its thing. And when applying it, you are going to get a little bit of streaking, but as it dries, it will settle. And then from the front, it doesn't look too bad. Now for his red gear, we're going to turn to Blood Angel's red. No great surprise there, of course. But you'll see on the front of him here, of course, he's got all of this fancy gubbins, which we are just going to paint straight over the top of. Don't worry too much if you hit the gold. As a matter of fact, you're probably going to count on it. Just make sure that you've got that red down. Now, same as with the cloak, when it comes to the front of his, what would you call this? His jacket, I guess. Try and keep your brush moving in the same direction. It'll give you a much smoother finish overall. Now, right now, that's going to look a little bit of a mess. And I have painted in his hands and basically the undersuit that he's wearing with a little bit of the same Blood Angels red. Later on, we're going to shade that to make it slightly more purple, as you see in like the product version, but that's going to work fine for now. Now, when it comes to his cape, this outer thing that he's wearing, you could use Volupus Pink here. That is going to look a little bit darker. And additionally, I tend to find on big flat areas like this, contrast can be a little bit of a challenge to get the most out of. If you do decide to go that route, then I would suggest use a little bit of contrast medium in there to help it flow. What I'm going to turn to instead, though, is Pink Horror. And you'll see this goes on fairly well. I'm probably going to need a couple of coats in some of the big flatter areas. And we are going to shade this later. So what I'm getting now is just throwing down my base coat. And when I come close to the edges of anywhere that I've done the skeleton horde, just tilt your brush slightly and use the flatter edge to paint along that crease. Like so, if any of that was on camera. Anyhow, I'm going to fill in the cloak now. Still not too worried if I hit any of the little... because he's got so many little bangly details, doesn't he? Anyway, let's paint this dude in pink. You will find, in order to get a solid coat there, you're going to need to give that 2 coats of pink, but that will look quite nice when it's done. And we start to see, yeah, we're getting somewhere with that. I'm turning now to black. This is Vallejo's flat black. Reason being is this is going to cover much easier than if I were using, Abaddon black. So what I'm painting now, any black details, funnily enough. And there's no reason that you couldn't have painted these with Black Templar earlier, but I tend to think at this stage we're going to find it a little easier to cover over with a true black and save some time there. At this point as well, I'm also going to paint in the shaft of the spear, just taking my time and slowing down a little once I get near areas that I don't want to have to paint a 4th time. Now there are a lot of gold details on this guy. So I'm going to I'm going to base coat mine with Retributor armor. You could use here Balthazar gold instead if you want a darker finish, like a little more burnished and aged. But I know I'm going to shade this in a minute anyway, and then highlight it with some Liberator gold later on. But if you do want darker, just start with a darker base coat. For now, though, I am going to content myself with my Attributor armor. Attributor? Goodness me. Can you tell? I'm concentrating. Now, if you catch a look at the painted example on the website, you'll see that the sort of bangle things that he's wearing on his wrist here, these are covered almost entirely in gold and just shaded in between. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm not worried about whether or not I can see any red in between them. We're just going to give them a quick base coat of our Retributor armor. Why is he wearing so much gold? That, unfortunately, there is not really a quick way of doing that stage. You're just going to have to knuckle in and put all of that gold on. In some areas, particularly on parts that you've painted red, you are going to want to do a second coat, so grit your teeth, get on with it. But once it's done, it's done. And it is pretty easy. It's not like they're in any complex positions. Now we're going to go to the last time we're going to tidy up the white. Oh my goodness. But on the plus side, like I said, last time. So any last little bits and pieces, finally we get to go somewhere with the white, rather than just tidying it up. I have here some Apothecary white, which of course is actually not white, it's a very slight blue, but it does make for a really good shade over flat white. So I'm going to apply this over all of the white details, let it pool and collect, and then later on we're going to highlight this with some pure white. Yeah, I said it again, but this will give us a nice layered white surface without having to do a lot of work. Now as that apothecary white dries, it's going to tighten up and it's going to flatten out a little over the flat surfaces, but draw into the recesses where the detail is, which is nice. We are going to need to highlight it later, but for now, that's looking pretty good. I've got now at last some Agrax Earthshade. What I'm going to do is apply this over the gold fairly carefully. I've got myself a medium layer brush here rather than the big old shade brush. Very carefully painting this into, or over, our gold details. Don't worry, like with these little gaps here in the wings on his chest, just paint some into those as well. That's going to work just fine for the shading. When it comes to the bangles and what have you, that's much easier. Just go nuts there. It's only once I've reached this point that I realize I've actually forgotten a detail, and that is the strap and pouch on the front of his, I guess, equipment. I'm going to start with some Wraithbone to paint the cord for this, and then some Steel Legion Drab to paint the pouch itself. Now once this is dry, I am going to Agrax it with the rest of everything else, so I probably should have painted these first. Whoops! Now while your Agrax Earthshade dries, you can turn to now some Carroburg Crimson, and this is what I'm going to use to shade that pink. You'll notice it's not very pink going on. I mean, Carroburg Crimson is a nice sort of reddish shade, but just make sure you're covering over all of your pink stuff with it rather. Anywhere that it collects a little too much, you can shift away with your brush while it is still wet. But yeah, nice quick coat of this. This will give us plenty of shading on that pink. When it comes back to highlighting that pink, what I've got here is actually Brown Rose. This is a Vallejo color, and it happens to just be a nice pink sort of color that I have. If you have the next, Citadel pink up from whatever pink horror is supposed to be highlighted with, then of course you could use that. But I've got this, and it's going to work just fine. Just a little bit of this on some of the highest points and creases. And again, something where you don't necessarily have to use the tip of your brush. Just a quick flick with the edge, and that'll be plenty in some areas. Now, if you're not happy with how that's turning out, you can go back with a little bit of your original color and tidy up those highlights. And I have across the back there. You'll notice I haven't done very much. It's not going to matter too much once it's varnished. I have now some Wild Rider Red, and we're going to do the same thing to his clothing. So just a little bit along the very edges and any creases that we want to accentuate. So along here, you can use an orange if you prefer here. I know some folks like a really bright orange, but Wild Rider Red, to me, that's probably going to be plenty. Now, to be quite honest, I forgot how vibrant Blood Angel's Red is. So as well as having done that Wild Rider Red, I've got here now Fire Dragon Bright, and I am going to go a little bit lighter along some of these creases and edges, because I've sort of laid down the very edge, but I want them to be lighter. So here we go. Now we're getting somewhere. That's looking a little more like it. I'm going to turn now. I have here Liberator Gold, and this is really up to you. How much of this you apply is going to change up the tone of the gold that he's wearing quite a bit. So if I put a lot of this on, this is going to look a little more like faded, sort of brassy color. But if I use it just as an edge highlight in some of the corners, instead it's going to look like a slightly faded brass. So as always, you choose how much of this you want to highlight with. I'm probably going to apply a fair bit. Now, being an Eldar character, this dude is covered in gems, and somebody with more patience than me would probably paint them a few different colors. I am going to stick to painting them blue because it's a nice contrast color with what we've used so far, and it will stand out without taking forever to pick like a dozen different colors. So I'm going to lay down a base coat of Cantor Blue on all of these gems. Then we're going to go straight to a really sharp and much lighter blue. I have Fenrisian Grey here, which is a grey that is a wonderful shade of blue. I'm going to paint a little half moon sort of shape in the bottom right hand corner of these gems. And I am concentrating, so I'm whispering. I'm not too fussed if it isn't perfect on all of these. Like, to be perfectly honest, I'm overpainting this guy at this stage. But as much as possible, even on these sort of horizontal ones, half moon shape. And yeah, fill in all of the gems. And there are so many gems. Why are there so many gems? Now, as with everything else so far, if you do find you apply a little too much, you can go back with your can tool blue and tidy up the shape of those gems. What I'm going to do now is with a little bit of white, so we're back to that again, just a tiny wee dot in one side and then the opposite corner of each of these gems. So there's a few of them. And of course, the other thing you can do with your white is any areas of white armor that you want to tidy up. Just a little bit of this applied now, and you will brighten that up considerably. The version on the product page on the Games Workshop site has a grey slate base, so I'm going to apply Basilicanum Grey fairly heavily over all of, well, the grey bits. I'm not too worried if I do hit his boots here. And then, in order to match the basing for most of my other stuff, I'm going to apply a little XV88 to the rim. Now, once this is dried, I'm going to take him outside and hit him with a Munitorum varnish. Ordinarily, I'd turn to a matte varnish spray, but in this case, I tend to find that with contrast, a slightly satin sheen does help to pull that together, and it looks quite nice, at least in my opinion. So let's get a look at what this looks like when this fella is all finally finished. And there at last, our Eldar Farseer is complete. Now, there's a whole bunch more that you could do to really push this guy, to a next level. There's a lot more highlighting you can do, there's neat little patterns you could be painting. Eldar really do benefit from going above and beyond. But if you want to get what is a quite striking miniature on the table without a whole lot of fuss, this is all very simple techniques, just one layer of paint over the other. And I think that's pretty cool. I'm happy enough to put him in the cabinet, and yeah, he'll look fine if ever I get around to doing an Eldar army, which is unlikely. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who keep me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support lets me get stuff like this. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time on it all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.